Freeze the noise and hold still, because a blunt message is incoming that can flip a worldview on its head, exposing 4 pervasive falsehoods seeded early in life to keep initiative dulled and dependence high, while genuine leverage slips away to those who understand that authority is seized rather than bestowed. A reality echoed across 5 centuries by a Florentine strategist whose handbook on statecraft codified pragmatic power more than moral comfort. Across eras, the same misdirections drain agency in plain sight, and once named, they evaporate like fog burned off by daylight, revealing patterns that explain why certain actors seem to glide from win to win while others grind without traction. The difference is rarely fortune and almost never pedigree, but a precise grasp of incentives, optics, timing, and decisive movement that aligns with how influence actually operates rather than how it is prettied up for polite society. Fortune as an idol explains little, because the real game rewards those who stop playing by nursery rules and start operating by adult realities. The kind set out in a 1513 field manual that remains controversial precisely because it reframed politics and power as problems of outcomes instead of pieties. The shock to sensibilities endures because results often prefer discipline over innocence and strategy over platitudes, even when soft narratives try to explain away sharp edges. The persistence of these 4 illusions is not accidental. They exist to make populations compliant and predictable, to sand down ambition, to keep attention on waiting, wishing, and hoping while the small minority that studies incentives and optics accrues advantage, and once those illusions are punctured, there is no return to the previous picture because the gears behind the curtain become visible and the map of what reliably works begins to replace the storybook chart. Preparation for an unvarnished look at the first deception matters. So set an intention in advance to withstand the discomfort of abandoning a well-worn habit loop, and post a compact pledge to anchor the shift, choosing to perceive reality accurately and reclaim rightful agency, a line aimed at training attention toward action and away from passivity, with the understanding that respect and outcomes track visible behavior more than noble intentions. Deception 1 says that patience alone brings rewards, a slogan that sounds gracious but functions as a lullaby, because while one person waits for alignment, another takes the first bite. And while one person celebrates preparation, another prototypes, iterates, and ships. Those who conflate waiting with virtue end up romanticizing inertia, whereas those who accumulate small, observable moves quickly build a reputation that compels responses and opens doors that never swing for silent diligence. In career contests, the quieter resume may be stronger, but the bolder operator follows up, surfaces proof of value, builds internal allies, and turns ambiguity into reasons to be chosen, which illustrates a general rule: opportunities rarely stand still, so they are created, not queued for, and the trap is the moral glow of inaction dressed as prudence while the clock keeps paying compound interest to whoever moves first under uncertainty. History's practically successful figures learn to act with incomplete information, to accept that a confident 80% answer today often beats a flawless answer next season, and that reality seldom calculates fairness points for duration of waiting. In this scheme, discomfort becomes tuition, rejection becomes data, and uncertainty becomes a battlefield, where momentum belongs to those who step into it rather than to those becoming experts at contemplating when to begin. This counter-habit is to bias every day toward imperfect execution, to request outcomes instead of hoping to be discovered, and to prefer post-action adjustments over pre-action paralysis. Ownership is demonstrated in the open, attention is magnetized by tangible signals, and recognition is negotiated rather than donated. So a crisp pledge helps. Acting now to manufacture openings and earn outcomes. A compass line for trading inertia for motion. Deception 2 claims that respect is a universal entitlement. But respect functions more like premium currency than a participation trinket. And confusing courtesy with esteem flattens standards until high performance and low performance weigh the same. Appearances carry outsized influence because most observers judge by what is seen rather than by what is verified. A dynamic long noted by Renaissance analysis that treats image management as part of the operating system, not a cosmetic add-on. By distributing esteem without discrimination, standards communicate that results and contribution are secondary, and observers calibrate accordingly, which turns leaders malleable and teams indifferent. Reserving true regard for earned behavior while extending politeness to everyone establishes a clear exchange rate where competence, character, and delivery purchase access. and posture without performance is gently acknowledged, but not given control over attention or resources. In situations where status is assembled by political proximity rather than output, a quiet refusal to overvalue unearned influence becomes a test that sorts contenders from pretenders. Those who aim to earn respect tend to recognize boundaries and step up, whereas those who demand deference on entry often bristle when standards hold, and in that moment, clarification arrives about who belongs close to decisions and who only imitates the posture of seriousness. This is not a license for discourtesy, because baseline civility is always a net positive in complex systems. But esteem that cannot be counterfeited is what sharpens cultures, invites excellence to reveal itself, and tells low-effort tactics that the exchange rate is unfavorable. In that environment, guidance becomes clearer, feedback becomes more honest, and performance climbs because the signals are not muddied by equalizing what is plainly unequal in contribution and reliability. A lens from early modern statecraft clarifies why both deceptions persist. Affection is fragile where incentives cut across it, and spectators are swayed by what can be seen. So banking on invisible virtue and universal esteem is like purchasing security with a currency the market refuses to honor. The safer path for guarding interest involves building unmistakable leverage and visible value, even while maintaining restraint, because idealized goodwill rarely survives stress tests. Translating that into everyday tactics means building a trail of actions that can be pointed to by outsiders, making it easier for decision-makers to justify their choices publicly, ordering time around initiatives that move in days rather than in quarters, and treating outreach as a routine rather than as a special occasion, so that selection biases tilt toward the operator who has already made the next step easy for everyone else involved. It also means winnowing counsel, weighting feedback from those with demonstrated outcomes over noise from spectators, and aligning social presence with a consistent, professional optic because those who only see the surface will use that surface as the entire file, a phenomenon encapsulated in observations about the primacy of appearance, in shaping judgments and the prudence of managing signals, with intent rather than leaving, reputation to drift on accident and assumption, the opposite of weighting is controlled initiative, the opposite of indiscriminate esteem is calibrated respect, and behind both pivots sits the same principle. Influence compounds where action and optics intersect with credible results. A triangle much easier to stabilize once comforting slogans have been discarded. The sooner those slogans are recognized as tranquilizers, the sooner energy returns to the levers that actually move outcomes in organizations, markets, and relationships. Seen through the Renaissance manual that still rattles genteel sensibilities, none of this mandates cruelty, only clarity about how human groups allocate trust. Fear, admiration, and status under pressure, and clarity is liberating because it replaces superstition with levers. By choosing levers, risks become measured rather than paralyzing, and progress starts to look less like fortune and more like a pattern of choices aligned with how incentives pay out in the real environment. The practical next step is a 90-day sprint built around 3 lanes: public proof of value every week, targeted outreach every day, and one visible bet every month. A cadence that forces contact with reality and aligns reputation with delivery. Under that cadence, the myth of luck tends to wither, and selection starts to arrive not as a surprise, but as the natural byproduct of visible, cumulative movement that benefits others first and is therefore welcomed. Calibrated respect, meanwhile, can be enforced with simple resets. Protect calendar blocks for builders and decision-makers, funnel drop-in requests through criteria that reward preparation, and use metrics that differentiate noise from signal so that esteem maps to contribution. As those practices take root, expectations update system-wide. High performers feel fairly seen. Low performers receive clear ladders to climb, and the culture begins to reward the behaviors it claims to value. What emerges after these 2 illusions are retired is a cleaner field of view. Initiative no longer competes with a conscience built to glorify waiting, and standards no longer apologize for treating outcomes as meaningful, which together make room for sharper strategy and sturdier confidence. From there, the remaining deceptions become easier to spot because they rhyme with the first pair, always offering comfort at the expense of power and always preferring optics without substance. A final anchoring thought from the same tradition. Being feared in practice often means being predictable in enforcement and stingy with exposure to exploitation, rather than being theatrical in menace. And being loved in the durable sense often follows visible competence and fairness more than it precedes them. So aiming for security first is not a rejection of benevolence, but a scaffold for it when conditions test everyone's resolve and memory. Close this segment by renewing a concise pledge that keeps action and standards at the center of gravity. Moving first, signaling value, and reserving esteem for what earns it. A short line to revisit whenever inertia and approval-seeking begin to masquerade as virtues, because the habits reinforced by that sentence compound in ways that turn fog into a map and drift into an itinerary that leads to measurable, defensible gains in agency and outcome. Stop scattering esteem like party favors and start treating it like a scarce asset that compounds when deployed wisely. Extend basic civility to every person encountered, but reserve genuine regard for people who demonstrate reliability, contribution, and character over time. Because words without evidence are only theater and flattery without substance is a tax on attention. Pay attention to quiet tells, how someone behaves when there is nothing to gain, the tone used with people who have no leverage, the pattern of promises made versus promises kept, and whether accountability is owned in public or outsourced in private. Track who creates net positive outcomes and who merely benefits from systems others built. One group leaves traces of value, the other leaves invoices and explanations. Esteem is not a charity, it is a signal, and signals guide resources and opportunity. Price it accordingly and standards begin to rise around it. When esteem is scarce and earned, reciprocity shows up, boundaries are respected, and the terms of engagement shift toward merit rather than volume. Post a pledge to anchor the shift in practice. Respect is merited, not automatic. Standards are high because self-worth is high. A third sabotaging notion dresses up comfort as virtue by suggesting that default identity should always be enough to attract allies, clients, and partners, as if growth were optional and discipline were a costume. In reality, every person is a constellation of competing selves, one biased toward ease and delay, one built around rigor and delivery, one primed for courage, one designed to hide, one focused like a laser, one scattered by every ping, and outcomes track which version consistently shows up under pressure. Authenticity has been misinterpreted as permission to avoid difficult upgrades, but sincerity and standards are not adversaries. Authenticity without ambition becomes a defense of yesterday's limitations, while authenticity plus aspiration becomes the engine for tomorrow's results. A Renaissance strategist once noted that crowds judge the surface while a minority learns the substance, which means presentation and performance must align. The chosen persona is a lever, not a lie. Choose deliberately, because the identity reinforced in daily routines pulls relationships, approvals, and opportunities into orbit, and the wrong orbit is hard to escape. Consider the fork in the road within one life. One option arrives late, makes explanations routine, complains about obstacles, and ducks hard conversations. The other arrives prepared, takes ownership when things misfire, frames problems as solvable, and addresses friction directly before it calcifies. Both modes live in the same person, but only one attracts responsibility, referrals, and trust. The be as you are cliché smuggles in a permission slip to remain at the level that produced current results. And labeling the easier mode as real me is clever branding for inertia. The higher standard is not an act. It is an unaffordable minimum for anyone who wants to be chosen when stakes rise. Expect social turbulence as the stronger version gains ground. Clear boundaries unsettle those who relied on porous ones. Direct speech unnerves those who prefer hints, and excellence feels like pressure to anyone invested in average. That friction is not a warning to retreat. It is confirmation that orientation is changing from pleasing to performing. People admired across disciplines tend to make the same trade repeatedly. Comfort exchanged for competence. Spontaneity tempered by preparation, mood subordinated to mission. The account executive who wings it because that's just the style tends to lose altitude with senior buyers who manage risks for a living, while the operator who over-prepares, frames value clearly, and thinks 2 moves ahead gets callbacks and renewals. The founder who works only when inspired and dodges hard hires or tough exits usually plateaus. The builder who sets a cadence, makes consequential choices on schedule, and reviews numbers with surgical honesty, builds a firm that survives preference swings and market headwinds. None of this demands falseness. It demands intentional identity. Prefer the self that earns outcomes over the one that earns excuses. Skill is the real costume. Wear it daily. Growth requires adopting new defaults, because tomorrow's achievements will not be produced by the same reflexes that maintained yesterday's comfort. The self that procrastinates will not ship the product. The self that avoids difficult conversations will not command respect. And the self that seeks applause will not make the unpopular correct call when it matters. There is, however, an alternate script. Act before confidence materializes, define limits and enforce them politely, and make choices using evidence instead of popularity scores. That version will unsettle those attached to unearned access or low standards, and it will simultaneously pull in collaborators who appreciate clarity, speed, and depth. Authenticity is not licensed to underperform. It is an invitation to align behavior with declared values, which is the most honest form of self-expression available. To make identity concrete, establish a small set of non-negotiables that embody the elevated version. Arrive early and prepared. Close loops within 24 hours. Over-communicate when stakes are high. And script difficult conversations before entering them. Stack 3 daily commitments that build signal power. 1 visible proof of value, 1 deliberate outreach that advances a relationship, and 1 mess reduced or removed. Shape environment to make the stronger self obvious. Wardrobe that signals intent. Language that emphasizes responsibility. Tools arranged for execution rather than entertainment. Capture the upgrade in a short pledge posted openly. Choosing the highest capability version, especially when it strains comfort. A 4th comforting myth whispers that events carry hidden meanings assigned by a mysterious plan, encouraging passive waiting for lessons instead of active adjustment. That framing is soothing, but it quietly transfers agency to something outside the decision maker. Most outcomes follow chains of choices, capabilities, timing, and luck. Meaningful control enters where decisions and preparation live, not where narratives are invented. When difficulty strikes, 2 paths present themselves. Go hunting for a metaphysical explanation that reduces urgency, or identify direct actions that change probabilities in the next round. One path preserves feelings while assets decay. The other restores control and compounds skill. The more time is spent extracting why-me stories, the less time remains for tightening systems, upgrading approaches, and putting reps on the board. Incremental revolts against inertia are what remake trajectories. Update the resume the day after employment ends. Schedule 5 conversations before the week finishes. Refine the pitch before the next meeting rather than after the 3rd, and write down the 3 behaviors that created the rejection so they can be addressed. A political realist once wrote about dismantling stale arrangements rather than guarding them. Not out of rebellion for its own sake, but because progress requires ending methods that no longer produce durable results. The same logic applies to personal strategy. Waiting for guidance the universe never promised is an elegant way to watch momentum die while competitors collect the opportunities that drifted past. Agency begins wherever the next controllable move can be made. Replace mysticism with mechanics. Examine what preceded the outcome. Ask what signals were ignored. Log which constraints bit hardest, and design tests that isolate a better step next time. What is often branded as bad luck is misdiagnosed. Preparation, foggy criteria, or optimistic timelines. What looks like good luck tends to be the meeting of readiness and timing after many invisible reps. Random shocks will always exist, and other people's choices will always be beyond command. But response is a sovereign space. Choose the role of responder and builder, not spectator and explainer. Use after-action reviews, pre-mortems for projects, and weekly retros to catch drift early, prevent single-point failures, and turn scars into standardized improvements. Self-respect grows fastest when cause and effect are studied honestly and acted upon quickly. This mindset shift saves potential that fatalism would quietly burn. No longer lingering in painful arrangements under the banner of meant to be, no longer making peace with stagnation by weaving comforting stories, and no longer letting a single failed experiment write a verdict on capacity. In relationships, tolerating disrespect as a lesson trains others to ignore boundaries. In commerce, labeling a stumble as destiny robs teams of the courage to iterate into product-market fit. Failure is a teacher that charges tuition, not a judge issuing life sentences. Extract the lesson, alter the behavior, and re-enter the arena with better odds. Upgrade the operating loop. Observe without self-deception. Orient to reality, not wishes. Decide faster with clearer criteria, and act with more reps and tighter feedback. That loop beats fate in every quarter where it is actually executed. Step back and connect the deceptions into one system. Waiting, masquerading as virtue keeps hands off the controls. Indiscriminate esteem trains others to discount standards. Default identity excuses low performance habits, and cosmic storylines excuse inaction after setbacks. The antidotes form a cohesive philosophy. Move before perfection arrives. Value select with care and courtesy. Train the highest functioning version to be the default under stress. And study causation relentlessly so responses get sharper each cycle. A hard-edged maxim from statecraft is often caricatured as cruelty, but its practical core is simple. Security comes from predictable enforcement and credible capability, while popularity follows when outcomes are felt as fair and valuable. Leadership, that signals both, becomes hard to push around without ever needing performative menace. Replace palatability with integrity, and like attracts like. Now do something with the map. Pick a 90-day window and set a weekly rhythm of proof. The deliverables shipped, the problems resolved, the people helped in ways they can explain to others. Set a daily rhythm of outreach, one specific ask or offer that creates future options, and set a monthly visible bet, a talk, a launch, a partnership that puts skin in the game. Guard calendar space like strategic high ground, protect mornings for build work, reserve afternoons for coordination, and corral notifications to keep attention from being taxed by every minor request. Build a scoreboard that rewards behavior. Within control, inputs and process quality, not outcomes alone, because results lag and will catch up if inputs stay strong. Momentum is mostly scheduling and standards dressed as luck from a distance. The window for decision is short because hesitation silently donates advantage to whoever moves. While consideration stretches, someone else takes the meeting, sends the note, makes the call, ships the experiment, or earns the vote of confidence. Knowledge without action turns sour quickly. Urgency redeems it by converting insight into traction. Finalize the internal contract in one sentence and write it where it cannot be missed. These 4 comfortable myths are rejected, these practical truths are adopted, and life is run from power rather than permission. One last pledge to post publicly for accountability. No more waiting disguised as patience. No more esteem without merit. No more comfort disguised as authenticity. No more fate where causation is available. Good outcomes do not drift toward bystanders. They are taken by those with standards, speed, and the nerve to enforce both.